Hey y'all, this is Thoughts Between Shots, a storytelling podcast where one great question leads to one unforgettable story. Every episode, I ask my guests to tell a story and then we break it down. If you want to get better at telling your own stories, asking more thoughtful questions, essentially becoming a better communicator, you're in the right place. This week, I'm super excited about my guest, so much so that I just want to jump right in. So let's go. My guest today is Mariam Shahab. Mariam, what is something that you've become particularly passionate about at this phase in your life?
Let me tell you a story. It was October 2021. I was out trick-or-treating with my 1-month-old son. He was dressed up like a tiny, adorable little fox. My costume, as I told my friends, was a zombie or maybe a mombi, because let's be honest, I was truly a sleep-deprived mom of a newborn. That's just how I felt. But I was determined to finally start making memories, even if it was during his literal witching hour. And I was feeling pretty proud of myself. But that's when it happened. A woman was walking by, a complete stranger, asked me, "Is he yours?" To most women, this would have been a silly but harmless question that they'd just brush off. But given my situation, it was actually a pretty loaded question. My stomach started to churn and my palms got sweaty. I was already exhausted, sleep deprived, and emotional. And now this? To explain why this was a big deal, I'm going to need to rewind a little. I had always wanted to be a mother. From the time I was helping change my younger brother's diapers, he was 10 years younger than me, to babysitting neighborhood kids when I was in middle school, I just assumed becoming a mother would be easy. That's the way it's supposed to be. My husband and I, we met in high school, got married after college, and just assumed we would be able to have children when we were ready. Well, when that time came, we weren't able to conceive naturally. And that's when we went on our fertility journey. We started to see specialists, undergoing lots of fertility tests, and that led us to a round of IVF and then a hysteroscopy, which ultimately determined the prognosis that my uterus is unable to carry a healthy pregnancy. Soon after I got that earth shattering news, it wasn't just me who shut down. The world shut down too because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Being isolated at home, I found myself constantly online, like everyone else, except instead of watching dance videos on TikTok and trying to perfect a Dalgona coffee recipe, my social media seemed determined to remind me of how everyone else was having babies, except for me. My Instagram was full of baby announcements, and Netflix seemed stacked with stories about happily pregnant women. And I found all of this incredibly triggering. It felt like everyone else was moving on with their lives, while I was over here just grieving something that seemed totally out of reach. But I'm a type A planner, and I knew I needed to take some sort of action. So I started by researching something my fertility doctor had suggested, and something I'd previously only seen on TV shows and movies, but never considered for myself: gestational surrogacy. Okay, so let me break it down. It starts with creating an embryo via IVF using an intended parent or donor's sperm and egg. After fertilization, that embryo is planted into the uterus of a gestational carrier. And yes, it's carried by another person entirely. It's basically like what Phoebe did on Friends. At first, it felt surreal. I mean, I'm a South Asian Muslim woman living in Texas, not some loaded Hollywood celebrity like Kim Kardashian, Chrissy Teigen, or Tan France. This was just not a route someone like me was supposed to ever take. But deep down, I knew I would do whatever it took to become a mother. So, on Memorial Day weekend, 2020, my husband and I found ourselves filling out surrogacy applications. Profiles about our favorite movies, travel dreams, mixed with sobering questions like whether we would terminate a pregnancy under certain conditions. Honestly, it felt like online dating and a college application rolled into one, except with much higher stakes. Trusting someone else to carry your hopes, your dreams, but most importantly, your child is a totally wild, vulnerable, and terrifying experience. But we tried to make the most of it. When we finally matched with our surrogate, a woman 6 hours away in Oklahoma, the journey truly began. We hopped on I-35 for the drive to Oklahoma to visit her for every major doctor's appointment. We recorded our voices on belly buds so the baby could hear us in the womb. We texted constantly about her cravings and her kids' silly nicknames for our baby. We also had an unconventional maternity photo shoot on top of a mountain in Oklahoma. And all of this helped us build a bond with her family as she was helping us grow ours. Of course, as you can imagine, For a South Asian Muslim woman and self proclaimed type A personality, I did face my fair share of challenges, the biggest one being letting go of control and embracing risk. Gestational surrogacy is quite literally an out of body experience. I had to accept that I couldn't control what other people were thinking about my decision to pursue parenthood in this way. I couldn't control what my surrogate ate or whether she exercised. I couldn't control how much parental leave I would get at my job. And I couldn't control the COVID-19 protocols that prevented me from being in the room for the heartbeat confirmation appointment or in the delivery room where my son was born. But what I could control and what I fought really hard for was showing up for my son in every way that mattered. I was even more clear on my resolve when my son was born on September 30th, 2021. I've never cried and smiled so hard at the same time as I did once he was finally in my arms. So let's go back to that stranger at Halloween who asked, "Is he yours?" She wasn't just questioning my motherhood, she was commenting on my appearance. She looked me up and down, surprised I didn't have the typical postpartum body because I hadn't given birth to him the usual way. Obviously, she had no idea of any of this, just like she had no idea how many years I'd fought, sacrificed, dreamed, prayed for this moment to come. Of course, he was mine, but that's the point. Our society has conditioned us so deeply to think about parenthood in one way that we don't even question our biases. We don't stop to think before we speak. So, whether this is the first time or 57th time you're hearing this, it bears repeating. Stop asking people when they're going to have kids. Stop asking people if they're pregnant. Stop asking people if the child with them is theirs. The journey to parenthood just doesn't look the same for everyone, and it's not fair to assume that it should. Families are built in all kinds of ways, through love, through resilience, through hope. And yes, it really does sometimes take a village to bring a baby into this world.
Yay. So, Mariam, I love that story. So many of these stories have been so impactful that it drew me to you and all of my guests, right? I've heard those stories in some form or the other, and I'm like, I need to know this person. I think with you and me, we met at a co working space back in like 2018. Even though we kind of kept in touch through LinkedIn and all of this stuff, when I heard your surrogacy story and when I saw you bravely put it out there, that was when I really took notice. And I was like, who is Mariam? I need to know her better than just in passing conversations. And so there's so much power to putting your story out there in such an honest and vulnerable way. So first of all, let's talk about who you are and what you do.
Okay. Well, I'm Mariam Shahab. I'm a mom, obviously. Now you know that. And professionally, I'm an inclusive communications and marketing strategist. Call myself a brand storyteller. Most recently, I founded Chatterbox Consulting to really focus on helping purpose-driven brands authentically connect with underserved and underrepresented audiences.
Okay, so yeah, so marketing background, that makes a lot of sense. Just with the finesse with which you brought out your story, tell me about the process of getting this story together, right? Because we both worked on it, but it was obviously your thoughts and it was an amalgamation of a lot of things that you've put out through articles and stuff like that. But what was this process like for you coming up with the story in this format?
Yeah, so I have shared my surrogacy story in a lot of different mediums in Instagram, on other podcasts, in written word, longer form articles. Some of them have been kind of the full story of before to after, some have just been the before story. And for me, working with you, Nami, is thinking about starting from a moment that hooks people in and gets them curious to know, how did you get to that moment? As opposed to starting from the beginning and saying, we were having fertility struggles and now I have a child and let me fill in the blanks for you. So that was really different for me, is just picking a moment and going backwards.
Yeah, this is kind of the formula I use a lot because I do a lot of Toastmasters and speeches and I love storytelling in general. So for me, it's always, okay, start with a cold open, pretend you just walked in the middle of a scene and then rewind and go to, how did this begin? What was the origin story? And a lot of times go back to your childhood or go back to some form of an origin story and then loop it back around to that moment again and then the takeaway. So I loved how well that worked with your story too. One of the things you mentioned a lot was, as a Muslim woman in Texas, it's a really unusual thing, right? You don't see this a lot. You don't see a lot of women, A, go down the surrogacy path, B, talk about it openly. So, how important was it for you to get your story out there in being able to shine a light on this, but also be basically able to convince people within your community of it?
Yeah, for me, it was twofold. One, controlling the narrative. By telling my story, I could tell people on a micro or macro level why I chose this path to parenthood and, choose how much of my medical history or not that I want to share and what the decision making went between me and my husband. But also, a big reason why I decided to share my story more often, especially once I'd had my child and I was on the other side, is because I felt really lonely when I was going through it. And I wanted to see stories like mine. I know there are other people who I've connected with in private Facebook groups, private Instagram DMs, but by sharing my story in a more public format, podcasts, articles, social media, I've connected with so many women who see either themselves, a sister, a friend, a colleague, and people who thank me for just sharing the story because they didn't know that this was a thing, or they actually are going through this themselves. And I've ended up being a friend, maybe a mentor, not a professional, but it's just really helped me build my own community in a way that I didn't even know I needed. But I love being able to be that support for others.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen this with so many things like that are considered taboo in our culture, right? I mean, I got divorced over the pandemic and I decided to put out a divorce announcement about it because I was like, okay, I'm no celebrity, but it's because I just don't want my parents to have to pick up the phone and tell all my relatives and have that awkward conversation. So I was like, I'm just going to put out an announcement. So I did that because, first of all, everyone takes cues from you on how to react to something, right? So if you're like, hey, this is totally normal, it's not a big deal, and you model that for them, they're like, oh, okay, got it. I am going to treat it like it's normal because that's how you're treating it. But also, it was interesting how many other South Asian women texted me in the DMs and were like, oh my God, I'm going through the same thing. And I was like, I'm so glad that you were able to then reach out to me because you saw my story. And it's not as taboo as we make it out to be. So sometimes it just takes a Mariam to normalize it through story. And speaking of stories, the way I found out about your story was I probably saw different angles to this in different articles. How do you figure out which angle to include when you're putting it out on different platforms, maybe?
It's actually all about the audience. For
Mm.
me, it's thinking about who's reading this and what do I want them to do with this information, right? So I've had an article published on the Motherly website, but who's reading the Motherly? Probably other people who are either current mothers or people who are trying to become mothers, versus my message when I'm doing it on a platform, which is more my professional platform. I've shared this story on LinkedIn, different versions of the story. This idea of normalizing a path to parenthood. Yes, people are talking more about infertility, but also my advocacy to get maternity leave and what that looks like in a workplace culture and how to ask for that, right? Thinking about the audience on LinkedIn versus a Motherly article versus some of what I talk about is how brands, because yes, I'm a marketer too, can be more inclusive to women who are finding other paths to parenthood and maybe not actually carrying the child in their belly. And yeah, that could be adoption, that could be surrogacy, it could be a blended family coming together, and how to still celebrate those milestones. So if I'm talking to other brands and marketers, reminding them that your usual language about a baby shower and baby shower games, or your usual language around what to gift to an expecting mother, could be different. There's a whole untapped market, just using my story as one.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I know a lot of people who don't come from the marketing world. An engineer or someone who has no idea how to connect a very personal story to something related to work. I think that's such a good point. When you told the story on LinkedIn, you were able to make a connection to, maternity leave or, yeah, a lot of workplace policies, trying to teach cultural competency. So I think for the audience, starting to think about how you can tell your story in a way that you can tailor it to different audiences, and it doesn't always have to just be emotional, or it can have a totally practical or pragmatic takeaway. Thinking through all these different angles based on your audience is so important. Now, sometimes sometimes people may think, okay, just by virtue of sharing something that's a little unconventional, or maybe she's just being sensational, or maybe she's just making a statement. What would you have to say to that?
It's a really good question, Nami, and it's something I think about. I think it's a little bit of imposter syndrome sometimes. I do second guess myself, and I don't want to necessarily be the surrogacy girl who's always posting about that. I'm more than that, but it's an important part of who I am and has affected every part of my life, professionally, personally, my friendships, my relationships, my family relationships, etc. So for me, when I think about combating that fear of thinking, should I post my story? Should I say something? Should I say something again? And not trying to sensationalize it, is just that humanity piece, remembering that I am one story. And it fuels me so much when I remind myself that even if one person sees this and thinks, I'm a little curious, or it changes a perspective on what is a viable path to parenthood and normalizing surrogacy because it feels so distant, then it's worth doing. And the other thing I do very intentionally is I choose when to tell my story. Sometimes it's just because I'm provoked. There's been things in the press, and if there is something there, negative conversations around surrogacy, then I feel provoked and I want to say something then because it's in the discourse. But also when there's something very personal happening for me. Mother's Day is always a moment that I am reflecting on how I became a mother. And there's so much conversation that is share a picture of your bump and things like that. And to me, that's my opportunity to enter a conversation in a unsensational way, because my truth, my story is I'm a mother who didn't have a bump. And that's not the photos that I'm going to share when I reflect on Mother's Day.
I love your perspective on this. This entire conversation has been so valuable for anyone who's hesitant about sharing their story. Where can people find you to learn or to see your storytelling in action?
I'm on Instagram at M Shahab, M my first initial, Shahab, my last name, Shahab, and Mariam Shahab on LinkedIn.
Thank you so much, my friend. This was so fun.
Thank you for having me on.
All right. Well, we'll see you next episode with a brand new storyteller. Until then, please like, share, subscribe, all the things. And that's a wrap on this episode of Thoughts Between Shots. If you laughed, cried, got goosebumps, learned something sneaky useful, share it with your people and get involved. Pitch me your favorite story or storyteller, or even tell me your favorite question that I can use in a future episode. You can do all that by sliding into my DMs. Until next time, keep being curious and telling good stories.